There's a house in Los Angeles that used to be the center of everything. For decades, the Playboy Mansion was more than a house. It was a symbol, a fantasy, a promise of a different life. But symbols crack. Fantasies collide with reality. This isn't just a story about parties and centerfolds. It's about what happens when an empire's facade crumbles and the people inside finally speak about what really went on behind closed doors. This is how an American icon went from glamour's pinnacle to cautionary tale. The Golden Era. When Hugh Hefner first laid eyes on the property at 10,236 Charing Cross Road in 1971, he saw possibility. His then-girlfriend, model Barbie Benton, had discovered the 5-acre estate in Holmby Hills, nestled between Beverly Hills and Bel Air. The Gothic Tudor mansion, built in 1927 for Arthur Letts Jr., was everything Hefner dreamed of creating. He paid just over $1 million for it. At the time, it was the largest residential real estate transaction in Los Angeles history. But this wasn't Hefner's first mansion. Back in Chicago, where Playboy magazine had launched from his kitchen table in 1953, he'd already established the original Playboy Mansion in 1959. That 70-room, 30,000-square-foot building on North State Parkway had its own underground pool, a secret woo grotto, and a front door inscription that read, in Latin, essentially, "If you don't swing, don't ring." The Chicago mansion was where the legend really began, where celebrity guests would slide down a fireman's pole from the living room straight into the basement pool, where a young photographer captured Krista Speck jumping topless into that pool, an image seared into the memory of anyone who read Playboy in the 60s, where the lines stretched down Michigan Avenue in sub-zero temperatures just for a chance to get into the Playboy Club. But Los Angeles was different. Los Angeles was where Hefner could build his Shangri-La. Working with architect Ron Smith, Hefner transformed the estate into something that had never existed before. 22 rooms, nearly 22,000 square feet, a wine cellar with a Prohibition-era secret door, a full movie screening room with a built-in pipe organ, a game house on the north side dedicated entirely to entertainment, tennis courts, basketball courts, a citrus orchard, tree ferns and redwoods, exotic animals wandering the grounds, peacocks, flamingos, monkeys swinging in the trees, and of course, the grotto. That man-made cave with its whirlpool and waterfall became as famous as the mansion itself. The mansion wasn't just Hefner's home. It required a staff of nearly 80 full-time employees, butlers, security personnel, electricians, plumbers, landscapers, zoo staff, and executive chef, all working to maintain what Hefner called his Disneyland for adults. The scale of the operation was staggering. The wine cellar held thousands of bottles. The kitchen operated like a restaurant, preparing meals for Hefner, his girlfriends, and whatever guests happened to be around on any given day. The landscaping team maintained the citrus orchard, the koi pond, the extensive gardens with their tree ferns and redwoods. The zoo staff cared for peacocks that strutted across the lawns, flamingos that stood near the pools, monkeys that had their own habitats among the trees. Every detail was carefully orchestrated. Hefner was particular about everything from the temperature of the pools to the selection of films shown in his screening room. He'd inherited a love of cinema from his childhood, and movie nights at the mansion were sacred. He maintained a strict no-talking policy during screenings. If you disrupted the viewing experience, you wouldn't be invited back. By 1974, when Hefner moved there permanently from Chicago, the Playboy Mansion had become the most famous party house in the world. Everyone wanted an invitation. Rock stars, movie stars, politicians, athletes. Barbra Streisand attended parties there. Tony Curtis was a regular. The Rolling Stones stayed at the mansion once and reportedly trashed a couple of rooms. They weren't invited back, though the story only added to the mansion's mystique. The annual Midsummer Night's Dream Party became legendary. Hundreds of guests in elaborate costumes, entertainment throughout the grounds, performances that went late into the night. The 4th of July fireworks shows, made possible by the mansion being the only private residence in Los Angeles with a permanent fireworks permit, lit up the sky. Neighbours might have complained about other aspects of mansion life, but those fireworks were something special. Fight Night became another signature event. Halloween parties that transformed the estate into elaborate fantasy worlds. New Year's Eve celebrations that drew the most exclusive guest lists in Hollywood. For a certain type of person, an invitation to the Playboy Mansion was the ultimate status symbol. Inside those walls, Hefner created his perfect world. He wore his silk pajamas day and night. He screened movies with a board of friends who curated titles, and he had a zero-tolerance policy for disruptions during screenings. He ate pounds of M&Ms and drank dozens of Pepsis daily, all handed to him wrapped in red napkins. The world saw glamour. The world saw liberation. The world saw a man who'd built an empire on the idea that pleasure was a philosophy worth defending. But the world couldn't see everything. Behind the gates. The thing about gates is they keep people out, but they also keep people in. For the women who lived at the Playboy Mansion, reality was something very different from what appeared in the magazine spreads or on the evening news. The 3rd and 4th floors of the Chicago mansion had rooms that playmates and nightclub employees could rent for $50 a month. No male visitors allowed. In Los Angeles, the arrangement evolved, but the rules remained strict. Isabella St. James, one of Hefner's girlfriends, published her memoir in 2006. Her descriptions of the mansion were jarring. She wrote that everything felt old and stale, that Archie, the house dog, regularly relieved himself on the hallway curtains, adding what she described as a powerful scent of decay to the general atmosphere. She noted that each bedroom had mismatched random pieces of furniture, as if someone had shopped at a charity store for the basics. The mattresses were old, worn, and stained. Even the sheets were past their best. This wasn't the palace that millions imagined. This was a house that had stopped being maintained somewhere along the way. While the parties continued and the cameras flashed, the infrastructure was quietly deteriorating. But the physical decay was just one part of the story. The women who lived there operated under a specific system. They received a weekly allowance, typically around $1,000. In exchange, they were expected to be available, to attend events, to participate in what Hefner wanted, when he wanted it. Some described a strict curfew, usually 9 o'clock, unless they were out with Hefner himself. The rules were never written down, but everyone knew them. You had to ask permission to leave the property. You had to attend certain parties, appear at certain events. Your appearance was scrutinized constantly. Weight gain was unacceptable. Aging was unacceptable. Falling out of favor meant losing everything. Your room, your allowance, your position in what some called the hierarchy. Because there was a hierarchy. A pecking order among the girlfriends. Usually, one woman held the position of main girlfriend. She got certain privileges, certain considerations. The others orbited around her, competing for attention, trying to move up. It was a system designed to prevent solidarity, to keep women focused on pleasing Hefner rather than supporting each other. Jealousy and competition were built into the structure. The mansion had an in-house doctor, Mark Saginaw, who people called Dr. Feelgood. His role went beyond typical medical care. He was known for handing out prescription and non-prescription substances freely. His daughter Jennifer lived in the mansion for several years during her teenage years. She later described being encouraged to get cosmetic procedures at just 15 years old. Saginaw allegedly told one woman that cocaine would help her asthma. He pushed breast augmentations on women who didn't necessarily want them. His presence at the mansion was constant, his relationship with Hefner described by some as unusually close. Some even alleged that their relationship went beyond friendship, though the full nature of it remains murky. The pressure to look a certain way was constant. Women described a culture where everyone was getting work done. Breast augmentations were common, expected even. The goal seemed to be uniformity. Everyone blonde, everyone enhanced, everyone fitting the same mould. Holly Madison arrived at the mansion in 2001. She was sleeping on someone's couch, struggling to make it in Los Angeles, and the mansion seemed like an opportunity, a place to reset, to not worry about bills for a while. She was 21 years old, working as a waitress at Hooters, trying to break into modelling or acting or something that would justify the move to California. Her first night there changed everything. She described Hefner offering her pills he called thigh openers, Quaaludes essentially, a sedative that had been banned in the United States in the 1980s, but that Hefner apparently still had access to. She declined them, but the evening progressed anyway. She was drunk. Things happened that she hadn't expected, hadn't prepared for, hadn't really consented to in any meaningful way. Afterward, she felt out of control, thrown into something she hadn't expected. But she stayed. She convinced herself she was fighting for something, that sticking it out meant she could get something valuable from the experience. The reality was different. She moved into one of the bedrooms upstairs, sharing a bathroom with another girlfriend who had what Madison described as an obsession with laxatives. The thin walls meant she could hear everything that went on in that bathroom. It was one of many small indignities that added up over time. Instead, she found herself sinking into depression so severe she sometimes thought about ending her life. She'd stand in certain spots at the mansion, places where she could imagine it happening, and have to talk herself down. The famous metal gates that were supposed to keep admirers out began to feel like they were locking her in. She felt trapped by her own choices, embarrassed to admit she'd made what she now saw as a terrible decision. She had confidants. Hefner's longtime secretary, Mary O'Connor, was someone she could talk to, though Madison was always careful not to reveal the full depth of her despair. O'Connor was loyal to Hefner first, and Madison knew that. She told Bridget Marquardt, who would become her co-star on Girls Next Door, more of the truth. But even with Bridget, she held back, too embarrassed to fully admit how badly she was struggling, because admitting that would mean admitting she'd made a terrible choice, that the bold decision to move into the mansion had been a mistake. She wasn't ready to face that. Years later, she would describe the experience using a specific term: Stockholm Syndrome, the psychological phenomenon where hostages develop positive feelings toward their captors. It wasn't a perfect analogy. She wasn't literally held captive, but emotionally, psychologically, she felt unable to leave, bonded to someone who was controlling her life in ways she didn't fully understand at the time. And what was really happening during those nights wasn't discussed openly. The system was clear. All the girlfriends would gather in Hefner's bedroom, where adult films played on large screens. The ritual was always the same. The women were expected to participate in acts with each other, while Hefner was with whichever girlfriend held the main position at that time. For many, it meant waiting for the night to end, going through motions, hoping it would be over soon. Some women knew what they were getting into. Others thought they understood and discovered the reality was much darker. And some were manipulated into situations they never would have agreed to if they'd known the full truth. But here's where the mansion's real power came into play: control through documentation. The surveillance. Hidden cameras weren't a secret exactly. Hefner was open about his love of technology, his fascination with documenting everything. But the extent of the surveillance was something few people understood until much later. Former staff members described an extensive system: cameras in bedrooms, cameras in common areas. all the footage stored in a library off Hefner's bedroom, a room that was strictly off-limits to everyone except Hefner himself and his longtime executive secretary, Mary O'Connor. Staff members said that being caught near that room meant immediate termination. The tapes served a purpose. Former girlfriends and employees described a culture of fear around what had been recorded. If you participated in something at the mansion, if you were filmed, that footage could be used. Not explicitly as blackmail perhaps, but as an understanding, as leverage, as insurance that people would remain loyal to Hefner and protective of the Playboy brand. When women later tried to investigate what happened to all those recordings, they were told the tapes had been put in a barrel and taken out to sea. Whether that's true or not, no one really knows. What is documented are the parties themselves, the regular events where women were expected to maintain certain standards. Former playmate Mickey Garcia described a classification system. The most attractive women were invited to live in the main mansion. Those considered slightly less desirable were invited to satellite houses, sometimes called the Bunny House. At these locations, women would allegedly be given substances without their knowledge, then photographed or videotaped in compromising positions. The doctor, Saganor, was central to much of this. Beyond his regular medical duties, he allegedly maintained a steady supply of various substances. His relationship with Hefner was described by some as going beyond friendship, though the exact nature of it remains unclear. What's clearer is the culture of excess that permeated everything. In April 2011, the mansion made headlines when 123 people who visited the grotto during a fundraising event became ill. Health officials identified the bacteria that causes Legionnaire's disease in the water. People experienced fever, headaches, coughs, and other symptoms. The incident was a rare public glimpse into the maintenance issues plaguing the estate. But the real darkness wasn't in the water quality. It was in the tragedies that unfolded over the decades. The tragedies. In 1973, a woman named Adrienne Pollock passed away from what was determined to be an overdose. Pollock had connections to the Playboy world, and her death raised questions that were never fully answered publicly. She was found in her apartment, and while it was ruled an accident, people close to her wondered what role the Playboy lifestyle had played in putting her in that position. 2 years later, in 1975, Bobby Arnstein, Hefner's personal assistant, took her own life. Arnstein had been caught up in a Drug Enforcement Administration investigation into Hefner and Playboy. The DEA was looking into allegations of controlled substance use and distribution at the mansion. Arnstein was questioned, pressured, caught between loyalty to her employer and legal jeopardy. The pressure of that investigation, combined with whatever she knew and experienced working so closely with Hefner, became too much. She checked into a hotel and ended her life. Before she died, she left behind statements defending Hefner, insisting he wasn't involved in anything illegal. Whether that was true or whether she was protecting him until the end, no one can say for certain. Then there was Dorothy Stratton. In 1980, Stratton was murdered by her estranged husband, Paul Snyder, in what remains one of the most shocking crimes connected to Playboy. Stratton had been Playmate of the Year. She was beautiful, talented, and launching what promised to be a successful acting career. She was separating from Snyder, who'd discovered her working at a Dairy Queen in Canada and brought her into the Playboy world. But Snyder couldn't handle losing control over her. He saw her as his creation, his ticket to a better life. When she moved on, started a relationship with director Peter Bogdanovich, made it clear she wanted a divorce, Snyder snapped. He called her to his apartment under the pretense of discussing the divorce. Instead, he assaulted her, killed her, and then took his own life. The crime scene was horrific. Stratton was just 20 years old. Her death sent shockwaves through Hollywood and the Playboy world, It raised uncomfortable questions about what the Playboy system did to the people caught up in it, about men who felt entitled to control women they viewed as their discoveries or possessions, about the dark side of the fantasy. But those questions didn't linger long in the public conversation. The machine was too good at moving forward, at shifting attention back to the next party, the next centerfold, the next chapter in the Playboy story. These weren't just tragedies. They were warnings about what the Playboy lifestyle could cost, about what happened when the fantasy collided with reality, when the pressure became unbearable, when the darkness that existed behind the scenes caught up with people. But Hefner's machinery was powerful. The brand was too big, too connected, too defended. Law enforcement had relationships with Playboy. Politicians attended the parties. Celebrities vouched for Hefner's character. The media, by and large, bought into the narrative that Hefner was a champion of free speech, a pioneer of sexual liberation, a man whose Playboy philosophy represented progress. Even when Gloria Steinem went undercover as a bunny in 1963 and wrote an exposé describing a sexist environment that exploited and demeaned women, where employees worked long hours at minimum wage while dealing with constant propositions and mandatory medical exams, Hefner simply made some adjustments and moved forward. The machine kept running, the parties kept happening, the mansion kept standing as a symbol of something the public wanted to believe in, until the mansion itself started giving up the ghost. The decline. By the time the 2000s rolled around, something had shifted. Hefner was aging. The mansion was aging. The entire Playboy empire, once valued in the hundreds of millions, was struggling. Magazine circulation had been declining for years, unable to compete with the internet. The clubs had mostly closed. The brand was becoming more nostalgia than cultural force. But Hefner found a second act. In 2005, a reality show called The Girls Next Door premiered on E! Network. The show followed Hefner and his three main girlfriends, Holly Madison, Bridget Marquardt, and Kendra Wilkinson. To a new generation, the show presented mansion life as fun, light-hearted, even wholesome in its own bizarre way. Executive producer Kevin Burns had approached Hefner earlier that year with a concept originally called Hef's World, which would focus on Hefner himself. But network executives pushed Burns to shift the focus to the girlfriends, to get their perspectives on life at the mansion. That decision changed everything. The three women were shown shopping for party outfits, playing with their dogs, attending events. Hefner appeared as an elderly but benevolent figure, a grandfather in silk pajamas who'd created this magical world where his girlfriends could live their best lives. The show made mansion life look like a sorority house with better amenities. Holly was positioned as the romantic one, desperate to marry Hefner and have his children. Bridget was the smart one, the girl next door type who was pursuing a master's degree. Kendra was the wild child, the tomboy athlete who wasn't as interested in the glamour as the other two. These characterizations were carefully crafted. They were designed to make the women relatable, to give viewers someone to root for. The reality was more complicated. The show was an enormous success. The second season premiere drew 1.6 million viewers, setting a 3-year record for E! The third season premiere pulled in 2.16 million, making it the second highest season premiere in E! Network history. The women became household names, recognizable faces who launched magazine covers and product endorsements. Playboy published nude pictorials of the three women to capitalize on the show's popularity. The November 2005 issue featured all three together. They appeared on the cover again in September 2006 to promote the second season. The magazine, which had been struggling for years, got a boost from the show's success. The women became celebrities in their own right. They were marketable personalities, proof that Playboy could evolve with the times, that a new generation could be sold on the fantasy. But behind the scenes, the same patterns continued. Holly Madison described being prescribed medication for depression during filming. The antidepressant Effexor became part of her daily routine, helping her cope with the anxiety and sadness that the cameras never captured. She'd moved out of Hefner's bedroom into a spare room by the final season, but couldn't say so on camera. The show had storylines planned out in meetings before each season, creating narrative arcs that had little to do with reality. Holly got an internship at Playboy for a storyline, working in the photo department. She actually enjoyed it, finding purpose in the work itself. Eventually, she was hired as a junior photo editor. It was one of the few bright spots in those years, a reminder that she had skills beyond her appearance. The show also helped her build friendships with Bridget and Kendra, though those relationships were complicated by the competition inherent in the girlfriend system. They bonded over coming from working-class backgrounds, over being in a situation none of them fully understood, over small moments of normalcy in an abnormal life. Madison stayed until 2008, when she finally left the mansion at age 29. She'd been trying to have Hefner's child, even attempting in vitro fertilization, seeing it as her last chance at building the life she thought she wanted there. When that didn't work, she realized she had to leave. Kendra Wilkinson left to marry NFL player Hank Baskett in 2009, having their wedding at the mansion itself. Bridget Marquardt moved on to other projects. The show introduced new girlfriends in its 6th and final season: Crystal Harris and twins Christina and Carissa Shannon. Crystal Harris would eventually become Hefner's 3rd wife in 2012. She was 26. He was 86. But the mansion they were living in was falling apart in ways that no amount of staff could fix. The neglect that Isabella St. James had described years earlier had only worsened. The infrastructure was failing. Paint was peeling. The famous grotto, once the site of so many parties, was in disrepair. In 2016, Playboy Enterprises made a decision. They put the mansion on the market for $200 million. The catch was that Hefner would be allowed to continue living there for the rest of his life, essentially renting from whoever bought it. The asking price was ambitious. The actual sale price was half that, $100 million, paid by Darren Metropolis, a 31-year-old billionaire businessman whose family owned brands like Hostess and Pabst Brewing Company. Metropolis already owned the property next door, which he'd purchased in 2009. His plan was to eventually combine the two estates into a massive 7.3-acre compound. But first, he'd have to wait for Hefner to die. The Reckoning. Hugh Hefner passed away on September 27, 2017, at the age of 91. The cause was sepsis, a massive infection. He was buried at Westwood Memorial Park, in a plot right next to Marilyn Monroe, a final piece of symbolism for a man who'd built his empire on the fantasy of beautiful women. With Hefner gone, something shifted. The fear that had kept so many women silent began to lift. The loyalty that had been maintained through allowances, opportunities, and implied threats started to crack. Holly Madison had already published her memoir, Down the Rabbit Hole, in 2015, while Hefner was still alive. In it, she described the darkness of her years at the mansion, the depression, the manipulation, the feeling of being trapped. The book became a bestseller, but it was just the beginning. In January 2022, A&E premiered a 10-part documentary series called Secrets of Playboy. The series featured interviews with numerous women who'd worked for Playboy, lived at the mansion, or been connected to the empire in various ways. What they described was devastating. Former girlfriend Sondra Theodore alleged that Hefner manipulated her into situations she didn't want, hosting events she described as deeply disturbing. Other women came forward with allegations of being drugged without their knowledge, of being coerced into acts they didn't consent to, of a system designed to break down boundaries and normalize abuse. One particularly disturbing allegation involved actress Linda Lovelace, with claims that she'd been drugged and forced into acts involving animals. Others alleged Hefner himself engaged in similar behaviour with his own pets. Jennifer Saginaw, the daughter of Dr. Feelgood, described growing up in the mansion environment, being exposed to things no child should see, being encouraged into cosmetic procedures as a teenager. The allegations extended beyond Hefner himself. Women described being assaulted by celebrity guests at the mansion. Bill Cosby, who'd been a regular at Playboy events, was the subject of particularly serious allegations. In June 2022, a civil jury found that Cosby had assaulted a 16-year-old girl at the mansion in 1975. The documentary painted a picture of an empire built on exploitation, of women recruited through promises of career opportunities, then trapped through financial dependence and social pressure, of a culture where speaking out meant being blacklisted, where loyalty to Hefner and Playboy was enforced through both carrots and sticks. The director, Alexandra Dean, had to verify every claim with at least 2 independent sources before including it in the documentary. Even then, much of what she learned never made it to air because it couldn't be sufficiently corroborated. After the documentary premiered, more women came forward. 2 additional episodes were added to the series, featuring new conversations with women who'd never spoken publicly before. The Playboy brand, now operating as PLBY Group, quickly distanced itself from Hefner and the past. They released a statement saying that today's Playboy is not Hugh Hefner's Playboy, that they trust and validate the women's stories, and that they support those who came forward. But for many, the damage was done. The Playboy legacy had been permanently reframed from sexual liberation to exploitation, from progressive pioneer to predatory empire. And the mansion, that symbol of everything Playboy represented, stood empty, waiting for transformation, the renovation. Darren Metropolis had waited patiently through Hefner's final years. Now, with full control of the property, he could begin his plans. The agreement he'd made with the city of Los Angeles was specific. He couldn't demolish the main structure. The mansion had been built in 1927 by architect Arthur Rowland Kelly, and while it wasn't designated a historic landmark, the Permanent Protection Covenant meant Metropolis had to preserve the facade and restore it to its original grandeur. What he found inside was worse than he'd expected. Decades of deferred maintenance had left the infrastructure in terrible shape. The famous grotto was in such bad condition it would need to be completely excavated and rebuilt. The roof had to be replaced. Extensions needed to be added. Skylights installed to bring in natural light. Metropolis hired Richard Landry, an architect known as the King of the Mega Mansion, to oversee a renovation estimated at $10 million on top of the $100 million purchase price. Work began in earnest around 2020. The entire lawn was ripped up, pools were drained. The staff house was partially demolished to make way for a 4,400 square foot gym and garage. A 1,200 square foot guest house was planned. The kitchen was gutted and rebuilt. Bathrooms were completely redone. The project took 5 years. Photos that emerged in 2025 showed the finished result. The mansion had been transformed from the Gothic party palace into something that looked more like a European castle. The colour scheme shifted to cream and aqua blue. The overgrown vines and shrubbery were cleared away, replaced with meticulously maintained landscaping. A new tennis court was added. The rear deck was extended. A luxury solarium was built behind the pool. The grotto, that infamous centrepiece of so many parties and allegations, was completely reimagined. Where once there'd been a cave-like atmosphere, now there was an elegant spa area. Everything that had made the mansion the Playboy Mansion was systematically removed. The party rooms, the surveillance systems, the bedrooms where so much had happened, all gutted and rebuilt into something clean and modern and utterly divorced from its history. In 2018, before the major renovations began, Quentin Tarantino shot scenes for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood at the mansion. It was the first film production there since Hefner's death. The movie, set in 1969, recreated the mansion during its golden era, when anything seemed possible, and the darkness was still hidden. It was fitting in a way. Hollywood has always been good at recreating the past, at making the tarnished look polished again. The legacy. Today, if you drive past 10,236 Charing Cross Road in Holmby Hills, you'll see a beautiful estate, pristine grounds, elegant architecture, no hint of the decades of parties, the allegations, the tragedies that unfolded there. The Playboy brand still exists, though in a much different form. They've pivoted away from the magazine that made them famous. The last print edition of Playboy in the United States was in early 2020, though it continued in other markets. The brand now focuses on licensing, merchandise, and digital content. They've worked hard to distance themselves from Hefner, to position themselves as a brand about sex positivity and empowerment rather than exploitation. Whether they can successfully make that transformation remains to be seen. For the women who lived through the Playboy experience, life after the mansion has taken many different paths. Holly Madison built a successful career in Las Vegas, starring in a show called Peep Show, and later getting her own reality series. She married, had children, and created a life far from Hefner's world. She and Bridget Marquardt now host a podcast called Girls Next Level, where they re-watch episodes of The Girls Next Door and talk honestly about what was really happening behind the scenes. Kendra Wilkinson went into real estate and hosted her own home renovation show. Crystal Harris, Hefner's widow, became an advocate for Lyme disease awareness after her diagnosis. Bridget Marquardt developed a career in paranormal investigation and podcasting. Others haven't been as fortunate. Many of the women who passed through the Playboy system struggled with substance issues, mental health challenges, and the long-term effects of their experiences there. Some died young, others simply disappeared from public view. The larger cultural conversation about Playboy has shifted dramatically. What was once seen as a symbol of sexual liberation is now more often discussed as an example of how power imbalances can be disguised as freedom. How exploitation can be packaged as opportunity. How one man's fantasy can become many women's nightmare. The mansion itself, in its renovated form, will likely serve as Darren Metropolis's private residence, combined with the neighbouring property into a massive compound. He's spoken about honouring the estate's heritage while moving it forward. What that means in practice is transforming it into something so different that the Playboy era becomes just another chapter in the building's nearly 100-year history. In some ways, that's appropriate. The mansion was never really about Hefner or Playboy. It was a beautiful piece of architecture long before they arrived, built by people with their own dreams and purposes. It will continue to stand long after the Playboy era is forgotten by everyone except historians and documentary filmmakers. But the human cost of what happened there won't be so easily erased. The women who lived through it carry those experiences with them. The families of those who died in connection to Playboy live with those losses. The cultural impact of what Playboy represented, both positive and negative, continues to ripple through our conversations about sexuality, consent, power, and exploitation. The Playboy Mansion was never just a house. It was an idea made physical, a promise that pleasure and freedom were the same thing, that fantasy could become reality if you just had enough money and ambition and disregard for conventional morality. For a while, that idea seemed to work. The parties were legendary. The guest lists included some of the most famous people in the world. The mansion represented a life that millions of people dreamed about. But ideas have consequences. Fantasies have costs. And the reality behind the mansion's gates was far darker than the carefully crafted image suggested. The physical building has been restored, renovated, and reimagined. But the legacy of what happened there, the lives that were changed and damaged, and sometimes destroyed in service of one man's vision of paradise that can't be scrubbed away with fresh paint and new landscaping. The downfall of the Playboy Mansion wasn't just about a building falling into disrepair, though it certainly did that. It was about the collapse of a myth, the revelation that the emperor had no clothes, or perhaps that he was wearing silk pajamas that hid more than they revealed. In the end, the mansion stands as a monument to a very specific moment in American culture, a time when we were willing to believe that liberation looked like a group of women competing for the attention of a wealthy older man. When we accepted that empire building justified any behaviour behind closed doors. When we mistook access for power and visibility for agency. Those days are over. The gates are locked now for different reasons. The mansion has moved on to a new chapter, one that will hopefully be written without the exploitation and darkness that defined the Playboy years. But the story of what happened there, told by the women who lived it, will remain. A reminder that every paradise has its price and someone always pays it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.